Roe was misreported by the New York Times and other major media that it only allowed early abortions or abortions in the first 3 months. But the Roe decision more than once said that it was allowing abortion up to fetal viability,
Mhm.
which they thought at that time was about 20 weeks of gestation. So they said there was a right to abortion up to fetal viability. But then thereafter, they said the states must allow abortion even after viability in cases of life or health.
Welcome to Caring for Both, a curbside consult series by the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, or APLOG. On this podcast, we bring on experts to provide insights to support you as a medical professional in your life-affirming practice and career. I'm your host for today, Dr. Christina Francis, board-certified OBGYN and also the CEO at APLOG. The sort of cultural climate and legal and political climate that we live in since the Dobbs decision was issued from the Supreme Court in 2022 has been a bit tumultuous, to say the least. There's been a lot of good that's been done to protect life in states across the country and even some at a national level as well. But also, the pro-life movement has seen a lot of disappointments and setbacks as we've seen states pass really radical pro-abortion constitutional amendments. And also, as we've seen a lot of lies surrounding what induced abortion actually is, whether it's needed for women's health care, and whether or not women in pro-life states can still receive the life-saving care that they need and deserve. And so there's just been, I think, a lot of confusion out there. And so we really wanted to talk about, one, the history of Roe v. Wade, because I think now in some people's minds, that's sort of seen as, well, things were calmer under Roe. But I think we need to understand, what was Roe? Where did it come from? And also look at the landscape of our abortion laws across the US today. And today's guest couldn't be, I think, more knowledgeable than he is. He has extensive experience and insights on this topic. So let me introduce you to him, and then we'll get started with our conversation. Clarke Forsythe serves as Senior Counsel at Americans United for Life and is author of 2 books about the infamous Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade. One is Pushing Roe v. Wade Over the Brink, The Battle for America's Heart, The Human Right to Life, and a Future Full of Hope, as well as an excellent book that I would highly recommend. I have it on my shelf and I reference it frequently, Abuse of Discretion, The Inside Story of Roe v. Wade. Clarke has served on the AUL team since 1985, including 6 years as Vice President and General Counsel, overseeing their nationwide litigation and legislation strategy, and he also served for 10 years as president. Clarke has argued cases before federal and state courts and has testified before Congress, as well as many state legislatures. He is also a prolific writer on pro-life policy issues and has been a dear friend of APLOG for many years, going back to my predecessor, Dr. Donna Harrison. This is going to be part 1 of a 2-part conversation, so stay tuned next week for the remainder of this conversation. Clarke, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Dr. Francis. It's always good to be with you. APLOG is an essential organization in America today, and I'm always encouraged and heartened to see APLOG grow and prosper.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for that endorsement, and we're so thankful for the partnership, your partnership, as well as the partnership we have with AUL. We always like to get started by getting to know our guests a little bit better. So you have
Sure.
been defending preborn babies in the legal sector and on the cultural front for several decades now. Can you tell us more about your career journey and why this issue is so important to you?
Well, as you noted, I've been with AUL for 40 years. I suppose in college and then during the 1980 presidential campaign, I first, for the very first time, was kind of compelled to think about the question of abortion because it was an issue in the 1980 presidential campaign.
Sure.
And I happened upon a book that a friend advised me to take a look at by Dr. C. Everett Koop and the philosopher Francis Schaeffer called Whatever Happened to the Human Race. And that book was quite convicting and informative, and it really got me to consider the issue of abortion and other bioethical issues, really.
Mm.
The following year, I started in law school in the fall of 1980. And obviously, during my 3 years of law school, studied the Roe v. Wade decision and realized how bad it was. And I started to volunteer. I was first got in contact with American Jedi for Life while I was in law school. I started to volunteer after I got out of law school for about 18 months, which was actually a good time for me because it I worked in outside of AUL, and it taught me what I didn't want to do as a lawyer. And so finally a position opened up as staff counsel in early February of '85, and I joined AUL then. And at that time, the Blackman majority on the court was still dominant, and it was a very challenging time.
I'm sure. I'm sure. I having grown up in an era where Roe had been on the books for a very long time, I can only imagine what it would have been like to be working in this space, just within a decade or so after that Roe decision. So diving into that Roe decision, can you first sort of set the stage for us? Because I do think understanding the legal landscape prior to Roe also helps us understand, to some extent, the legal landscape that we're in now. So, can you sort of set the stage for us of what abortion laws looked like before the Roe decision?
Sure. Abortion was never a right in Anglo-American history. It was prohibited, and it was prohibited at common law in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, which the American colonies adopted, the states adopted. It was prohibited throughout the 19th century. And by the way, the recent decision by the court in Dobbs in 2022 goes into this in great detail. The states actually prohibited abortion except to save the life of the mother until the 1960s. Um, and then in the 1960s, um, several states, about 13 or 14 in 4 legislative years, 67, 68, 69, 70, those 13, 14 states adopted broad or broader exceptions. But at the time of Roe in January 1973, 30 states retained their prohibition on abortion except to save the life of the mother, despite having legislative debates, public debates on abortion in virtually all the states.
Hmm.
30 states still kept their laws prohibiting abortion except to save the life of the mother. Of course, Roe versus Wade wiped everything off the books. I
Hmm.
mean, even the most pro-abortion laws across the states were not pro-abortion enough to meet the Roe decision.
Mm. Wow. What a It's very interesting to hear you say that and think about sort of our state landscape now, which I know we're going to get into a bit later in this conversation. But the fact that, these weren't, I suppose some people might reference them now as sort of draconian abortion laws, but these weren't things that were in place that hadn't been debated. As you said, people were debating this, and the state still kept in place laws that protected life within their states until, as you said, the horrendous decision of Roe v. Wade, which we're going to get into a little bit about why that was such a bad decision. So you had all of these states that had good pro-life protections in place. They were taking care of the people in their states. What were some of the events then that paved the ground for the Roe v. Wade decision to come about? Because of course, as you said, this was such a drastic change when it's wiping out state laws in the vast majority of states across the country. So, what are some of the events that sort of made the ground fertile for the Roe decision to be able to be issued?
Well, I think it started with pro-abortion doctors in the 1950s wanting the laws loosened
Mm.
to protect them to do abortions, and there was a campaign by doctors to do that. There was also national kind of themes or issues. like the so-called quote unquote population explosion and concern about population in the 1960s and 70s, which undoubtedly influenced some of the justices on the Supreme Court. Um, and there was obviously a lot of action in the states to either quote unquote reform the laws or to actually repeal the laws, and and that activity was successful in just four legislative years:
Mm.
1967, 68, 69, and 70. But I kind of see it that the cause for life kind of got up and running by 1970, and no state by legislation liberalized or legalized abortion in 71 or 72.
Okay.
And unfortunately, the Supreme Court didn't really seem to notice that in the 2 years that they were deliberating about Roe versus Wade in 71, 72. But it's almost as if the movement toward legalization stopped as of 71 and 72, and the
Interesting.
cause for life was doing well in holding the line. But the Roe versus Wade decision was cataclysmic and swept away everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you detail very well in your book Abuse of Discretion too a significant lie that was used to justify the Roe decision. It has still been used to justify legalized abortion, and that was the lie that thousands and thousands of women were dying every year from illegal abortions in this country. And you have a great table in your book that actually details by year how many women were actually dying from illegal abortions. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that lie was used, and detail for people? Because honestly, I didn't really know the extent of this until I read your book of
Hmm.
how overblown these numbers were. So can you talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, there was a propaganda campaign in the 1960s claiming that there were 1 to 2 million or more illegal abortions, that the laws were simply flouted, um, and that 10,000, five, or it depends on who the activist was, but
Mhm.
5,000 or 10,000 women were dying every year in America. And you cited that chart using data from the National Center for Health Statistics going back to I believe it was the 1920s,
Mhm.
showing that the number of women who died from abortion was dropping regularly and definitely year by year, such that by 1967 or 1968, um, there were less than 100. I think it was something like somewhere between 50 and 100, perhaps.
Mhm.
Um, as you know, because of antibiotics that came in the aftermath of, or during, or after the aftermath of World War II. And so
Mhm.
the numbers were completely shrinking. And so the claims were completely out of whack with what we knew about the data. And also, if that many women were dying, it would have amounted to something like, a half or two-thirds of all maternal deaths would have been from abortion,
Mhm.
and those would have been detectable,
Right.
especially because this issue was followed and studied year by year by the National Center for Health Statistics and by other organizations. So, but those numbers were used in public propaganda campaigns. They were used in legislative campaigns. They were used in briefs in the Supreme Court, and it created the notion that things were chaotic, that this was an emergency, and that women were dying, and that if you just eliminated the laws, everything would be great.
Right, right. And, unfortunately, still a narrative that's used today that
Mm,
unsafe abortion leads to women dying, but quote unquote safe abortion, which is really what they're saying, legal abortion, does not lead to deaths. And of course, we know that deaths from abortion, maternal deaths from abortion, didn't end after the Roe decision.
mm,
They
yeah.
continued, and certainly now we're seeing even more with the increase in the use of the abortion pill. Was it, correct me if I'm wrong, but was it Bernard Nathanson, the former abortionist, who clearly said he's just owned up to it and said, "Oh yeah, we made those numbers up." Wasn't that Bernard Nathanson who said that?
It was, and as you know, he started an abortion clinic in New York City, in which they did something like 60,000 abortions, um, and he later, in writing books after Roe, said, that this was all made up for I mean, the numbers of 10,000
Hmm.
and 2 million were made up to spur the campaign.
Yeah,
and and
absolutely.
and and they knew it, that they were made up to spur the campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and certainly in this country, before the Roe decision, I'm sure there were some non-physicians and untrained people who were going around and doing illegal abortions, but the term back alley abortion actually came from doctors, trained doctors who were doing abortions, but they would have women come in the back door of their offices for abortions so that they wouldn't be seen coming in for that. That's where that back alley abortion term or phrase came from. And so once abortion was legalized, it was actually the same doctors doing abortions. They were just doing them legally now instead of doing them illegally. So if they were so dangerous before it was legalized, then they continued to be that dangerous after they were legalized by Roe.
Yes, there were, as you know, abortionists before Roe in major metro cities, Minneapolis, Chicago, LA, New York. And when Roe came down, they were transformed from abortionists to doctors doing so-called legal abortions, and they just kept doing them, now under legal auspices. And there are some good records about that, even in cases that got into the federal courts documenting that.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
you mentioned the 10,000 and the death figure and 2 millions and so forth, but as you know, there was also the claim that there was this history of abortion being legal, which wasn't true, and the Supreme Court unfortunately got confused with a lot of just myths about the legal and medical history.
Absolutely. Well, and unfortunately, we won't have time to dive deeply into this, but unfortunately, an organization that played a huge role in the Roe decision being what it was the American College of OBGYNs, or ACOG, which I know our listeners and viewers will be familiar with them. ACOG started out as saying that abortion didn't have any place in medicine other than what they, of course, termed a therapeutic abortion at the time. We would say, a situation where a woman's life is in danger. And yet they, against the opinions of most of their membership at the time, they issued in the Roe and Doe decisions both very pro-abortion amicus briefs to the court. And I think from reading your book, and I know from conversations we had, that likely played a large role in the Roe decision being issued.
Undoubtedly, it influenced the court because as well as the AMA, were influential organizations at the time. They were thought to be filled with, conscientious doctors and experts, who knew the data, and what they said was kind of taken as the gospel, unfortunately, and so they were influential. Yeah, the Roe decision had inherent defects from the very beginning that kept it unsettled for 50 years, and helped to explain why the court had to readdress Roe in the Dobbs decision and overturn it.
Absolutely. And we're going to get back to that in just a minute. But before
Mm.
we do, because I do think there's one important thing to clear up, maybe for somebody who might be listening to this who's not necessarily pro-life and thinks, we should just go back to how we were under Roe, that that was okay. I think a lot of people think that the Roe decision really only allowed for abortion in the first and maybe first half of the second trimester. But then, because of course the way the Roe decision and Doe decisions were worded were very careful for a reason. But I think a lot of people were under the assumption that those decisions allowed states to significantly restrict abortion fairly early on in pregnancy, but that wasn't actually the case. Can you just briefly review why, even under Roe, states would be able to allow for abortion essentially through all trimesters of pregnancy.
Yeah, Roe was misreported by the New York Times and other major media that it only allowed early abortions or abortions in the first 3 months. But the Roe decision more than once said that it was allowing abortion up to fetal viability,
Hmm.
which they thought at that time was about 20 weeks of gestation. So they said there was a right to abortion up to fetal viability. But then thereafter, they said the states must allow abortion even after viability in cases of life or health. And then in the companion decision of Doe versus Bolton, which was handed down the same day from Georgia, um, the Doe versus Bolton decision defined health as all circumstances, um, health, economic, psychological, relevant to the well-being of the woman. And
Hmm.
so that health exception drove a hole through any limits, even after viability. And that health exception was imposed by the courts for the next 49 years, reaffirmed by the Supreme Court, striking down regulations, and the federal courts struck down even attempts to limit abortion after viability. So it was completely open-ended, and the federal courts enforced that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and even the now late term abortionist Dr. Warren Hearn out of Colorado clearly said in multiple interviews that he did abortions well into the third trimester, 34, 35 weeks for purely elective reasons. He didn't acknowledge them as elective, but he said, if a woman wants an abortion at any point in pregnancy, that's enough of a reason for him to do the abortion, and clearly acknowledge that, which of course I think kind of blew apart the pro-abortion narrative of, these aren't happening for elective reasons, they're only happening in very extreme circumstances. And he clearly said, no, I'm doing them, at a time when babies can clearly survive outside of their moms. Of course, an induced abortion, the intentional killing of a preborn child at any point in pregnancy is never okay. But even the vast majority of the American public are in agreement that they certainly shouldn't be done after viability. And yet he was openly doing them under Roe, not just after the Dobbs decision, but under Roe, he was openly doing them and legally doing them.
Yes, and there were others, as you know, that specialized in late-term abortions in Dayton, Ohio, and Maryland, and other locales across the country. Hearn wasn't the only one, and these were, although politically they might have been unpopular, legally they were completely legal under Roe versus Wade.
Right, absolutely. Well, as we wrap up this first half of our conversation, Clarke, can you just tell us, in your view, what were some of the legal flaws of the Roe decision, and how do your critiques of Roe compare to the Supreme Court's reasoning for overturning the ruling? I imagine that they align in the reasons that the Roe decision needed to be overturned, and maybe also point out that some of these reasons aren't even necessarily coming from the fact that you personally are pro-life and wanted to see Roe overturned, but there were some real legal problems with the Roe decision.
Absolutely. As I mentioned, there were fatal defects that the court built into Roe versus Wade at the very beginning because of the manipulative way they created the decision and deliberated about it in 1971 and 1972. I mean, the way litigation is supposed to work, the way the rule of law is supposed to work in this country is that you have two parties who are adversaries and they argue about the facts and they argue about the law and they create a record in the lower courts that are then appealed to the higher courts. And there's an intermediate appellate review, and then there's a U.S. Supreme Court case. In rare cases do cases get up there. But
Mhm.
the adversaries create the record and the facts, and then the higher court judges review the record and the facts and the law. That didn't happen in Roe versus Wade. The cases were originally did not address the Roe v. Wade case from Texas, Doe v. Bolton from Georgia. They did not address the issue of abortion. They did not have a record about abortion. They were mostly about jurisdiction and procedure, which I won't go into, but the simple question of whether a state court criminal defendant could take their case into federal court. Now, that wouldn't require a record about abortion, and there was no record. There was no evidence. There was no evidentiary hearing or factual hearing. And the cases didn't go to an intermediate appellate court. They went straight up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so virtually everything in the Roe decision, we're talking about 50 pages of the opinion. Virtually everything in it, history, law, medicine, sociology, not part of any record. They were either the result of Justice Blackmun's research, his clerk's research, or interest group briefs filed by ACOG and other interest groups in the Supreme Court for the first time. That's not the way litigation is supposed to happen in this country. That's not the way the rule of law happens in this country. But the court was shorthanded at the time. There were 7 justices. There was a temporary majority of 4 who wanted to sweep away the abortion laws. And they just decided to ignore all the problems and push ahead to decide these cases as quickly as they could, sweep away the abortion laws before those 2 vacancies on the Supreme Court could be filled by President Nixon. And so no record, and they took these jurisdictional cases and decided, we're going to address the issue of abortion. We're going to decide there's a right to abortion. We're going to sweep away the abortion laws. So the history in the Roe opinion is false. It was repudiated. The notion that abortion was safer than childbirth, that's the greatest, most significant assumption that the court had in the Roe decision, that abortion was safer than childbirth. They had no reliable data on that. Justice Blackmun just picked some figures, really, not really even statistical analysis of the number of deaths from Soviet bloc countries in the 1950s, if you can believe that. And the notion that abortion is safer than childbirth shaped every facet of the Roe opinion. And of course, that's been shown to be incorrect as well. Yeah. So these problems shaped the Roe decision. And you might think, well, if they don't have a record, they don't have a lot of evidence, they're going to go modestly. They're going to have a narrow decision. They're maybe just strike down this life of the mother only laws. But in fact, it was an expansive decision. They decided to go for it and sweep away everything. And those internal defects never went away. They caused considerable problems for 49 years, and the Dobbs Court emphasized those as reasons to why Roe must be, and Casey must be reexamined and must be overturned, and the issue returned to the people. Absolutely.
Well, yeah, it returned to the people because what Roe did was they created legislation from the bench. Which is, of course, with our separation of powers in the United States, is not supposed to happen. And as you said, they didn't create narrow legislation. They created sweeping legislation, which, from my legal understanding as a physician, was one of the first major examples of that happening. Of course, that has happened since as well. But what overturning Roe did and the Dobbs decision essentially said, no, this is supposed to go through the legislative process. And so the focus then has certainly been on the states, but also allowed it to return to the legislative process at a national level as well, that we can have a voice as citizens through our elected officials. Well, Clarke, this has been a wonderful first half of this conversation. We're going to pick this up again in part 2 to discuss the similarities and differences between pre-Roe and post-Dobbs abortion laws and how we can know that women are able to be taken care of and taken care of well, actually, in states that have passed pro-life laws. So thank you to everyone for tuning in, and we will see you next time for part 2 of this conversation.